The price of admission today will be a chair. All right, that's just mic stands. That won't help. All right, now as I recall, after I dismiss people to class, then I preach. A long, long time ago, back when I wasn't good at looking at calendars and planning things out, I started a series looking at the miraculous signs in the book of John. John's an interesting book because John writes his gospel probably near the end of his life, probably when the other three gospels are in circulation already. They're not as accessible as they would be to you after the printing press and the internet and all that, but they're out there. John, much later, decides that he still has a story to tell. If you read the other Gospels, the other three, they kind of track together. There are some differences. Their personalities get into it a little bit, and they've got a little bit different audience, but they kind of track together, and they're often grouped together. John is clearly doing something else. He's telling the same story. He's telling the same true story, but he's doing something else. One of the interesting things that he does is instead of ever using the word miracle, he refers to them as signs. He also says multiple times in the book, hey, Jesus did so many miracles, there's no way I could possibly write them all down. Jesus did so many miracles, only he says signs. Jesus did so many of these signs that if we wrote them down, I don't suppose all the libraries and all the world could contain the books. Now, Barry said something interesting to me, 6 months ago, or whenever I was doing this series. He came up to me and he said, now how many libraries do you think that there were in the world at the time? I said, that is a good point. Not as many as now, but still, if it was one library, saying, if we wrote it down, our one library can hold all the books. If we were talking about the Nancy Carson Library, they were saying it couldn't hold all the books that had all the miracles, still a lot of miracles. So, that makes it really interesting because John makes such a point to tell you how many of them he does, but then John only talks about 7. Technically 8, but that 8th one is a different category and we'll get to it. But still, it's just, okay, well, John, if you're that selective, oh, by the way, it's not just that he talks about that few, it's that he numbers them. He goes through and goes, this was the first sign, this was the second sign, this was the third sign. He's very meticulous in the way he does it. So you say, okay, well, these must be really important. If he has all of these to select from, these must be really important. So what are they? Well, it's interesting because when you ask people, why does Jesus do miraculous signs, they say, well, it's to verify the authority of his message or something like that. The problem is, when you look at the ones that John selects, that definition doesn't really hold up. Miraculous sign number 1. Jesus got invited to a wedding. Well, actually, his mother got invited to a wedding, and he sort of got an invitation seemingly because of that. So Jesus and the disciples go to this wedding, and they're there as wedding guests. He doesn't have a speaking slot. They're just there. Eventually, Jesus' mother comes up with some servants in tow and says, Jesus, they ran out of wine. And Jesus says, again, and then the moral of this story is not, here's how you talk to your mother, but Jesus says, woman, what does that have to do with me? It is not my time yet. Mary, in true mother fashion, looks at the servants and says, just do whatever he tells you. And then he tells them to do something absolutely insane. Hey, you see those clay pots over there, the ones they fill with water and use for really religious ceremonies and nothing else? Yeah, fill those up with water and then dip some of the water out, take the water over to kind of the caterer, and that'll solve your problem. To be clear, to these servants, Jesus is just some guy. They don't know anything about him. I'm fairly certain that when they dip the water out, still water. As they're walking it over looking, they have to be thinking, yep, still water. They give it to the guy. The guy turns to the groom and says, and this is not a compliment, hey, I don't mean to tell your business, but most people, they bring out the really good wine first, and then when everybody's too drunk to know the difference, they bring out the cheap stuff. but you saved the best till now, idiot. I mean, that really does seem to be the implication. The servants didn't really know what was going on. Jesus has taught no message. And then John says, the disciples saw and they believed. Already his disciples, they already believe something. B, they believe he should go into catering. There's not a lot of, what else is there? I mean, they know something happened, but they already bought in. They're already his disciples. Now, that's weird for our definition of what miracles and signs are, and they all kind of track like that. What John selects so far have been really odd. They really seem to be, with one exception, they seem to be responses to a situation. The water into wine one, he doesn't particularly want to do. He gets talked into it. And John says, this was the first sign by which Jesus showed his glory. He didn't want to do it. The rest of them seem to be a response to a situation that he walks up on or a request where somebody comes up to him, and none of them work like you would think they would. The one exception to that is after he feeds the 5,000 men, probably more. The disciples go out on a boat, and Jesus comes out to them walking on the water, which is not really a response to anything. It just kind of demonstrates right after the crowd sees him doing the feeding everybody with a kid's sack lunch, and they're like, that seems good. And so they're going to make him king by force, which is not force him to be king, because how would you do that? It's, we're ready to take on Rome and overthrow Caesar and put Jesus on the throne, because look what he can do. And Jesus has zero interest in that scenario, and he kind of disappears. The disciples head out across this sea, lake, and Jesus comes out to them walking on the water. Now, in one sense, it demonstrates his sovereignty over all creation, saying, Caesar, I don't want to take the demotion. They call out to him and they say, hey, who are you? And he says, don't worry, it's me. It's what your English translation will say, but in Greek it reads like this. Don't worry, I am. In Greek it's ego eimi, which if you look at the Greek translations of the Old Testament, that's the name that God gives to Moses when Moses says, who should I say it is that sent me? I am. So Jesus demonstrates his mastery, his sovereignty over creation, and identifies himself as God. And that leads us into this week. Turn, if you will, to John chapter 9, starting in verse 1. John 9, starting in verse 1. As he went along, he being Jesus, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of those of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, is this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself said, I am the man. How then were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. All right, so here's the situation. Jesus and his disciples are walking, and they come upon a blind man who's sitting on the road and begging. And John, the narrator, goes ahead and tells you, and this man was blind since birth. It's an interesting detail. It gives you kind of background on it, but it also tells you that, because you got to understand this is going to be the kind of accusation because it's the one that you would think of first. The guy's not a shill. He's not a plant. This is a guy who had lived in this place and been blind since birth. Either it's the longest con ever or it's legit. The guy's been blind since birth. He's been begging. Everybody in town knows him. They get up to the guy, and his disciples kind of stop and point to the guy and they say, Jesus. And I really do think they think they're about to impress Jesus with their question. Hey, Jesus, here's a blind guy. Tell us, is he blind because he sinned or because his parents sinned? Multiple choice question, Jesus. Was it A, he sinned, which is an interesting option for a guy who was blind from birth. I'm not sure when he would have sinned. Or B, his parents sinned, and that's why something bad happened to him because his parents sinned. Which one is it, Jesus? Now, why would they ask such a horribly insensitive question? Assuming they ask it out loud in front of him. Hey, Jesus, we know that somebody screwed up. So who was it? This guy, and he's being punished for it, or his parents, and they're being punished for it through him? For a long, long time, people have had trouble dealing with things in the world being not the way they're supposed to be. And when we see suffering, our impulse, our reflex is to somewhat distance ourselves from it, especially if it's something really difficult that we don't know how we would deal with. And what we want to have is nice, reasonable, manageable explanation as to why that happened to them, so we know that it couldn't happen to us if we just play our cards right. And so you get things like, hey, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. Be good, bad things won't happen to you. You'll find some articulation of that and everything from karma to just kind of the way people talk about when bad things happen in the world. And you do it too. Something good happens and you're like, somebody up there mustn't like me. Despite the enormous amount of scripture that is put forth to combat exactly that idea. God doesn't play favorites. He causes the rain to fall on the righteous and the wicked. He causes the sun to shine on the good and the unjust. Book of Job, which is a poem. I mean, it's written in Hebrew poetry. It sets stuff up theologically that doesn't happen anywhere else in the Bible. But they put Job forward as a guy who's so righteous that if you read it at face value, he's basically Jesus. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's blameless, and bad stuff happens to him for really ridiculous reasons, as explained. In the midst of kind of the height of his suffering, Job's friends come and they do something good for several days. They show up and they don't say anything. And then they screw it up by talking. And when they talk, they say this: hey, Job, we know the bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people, bad things are happening to you, do the math. And Job says, I really don't think that's it. That's about 20 chapters. After that, one of Job's friends, Job gets so frustrated with him that he says, I wish God would come down here and explain this to me. One of his friends helpfully says, you idiot, God doesn't do things like that. And then God does. Kind of blast that guy off the map, metaphorically, for saying it. And then he starts by saying, who do you think you are? But then it very quickly, within just a matter of sentences, becomes, wait. Who do you think I am? And he talks about how intimately involved in every aspect of creation he is. And how he cares when baby deer are born. So do you really think he doesn't care about your suffering? It doesn't offer an explanation because explanations, frankly, aren't that helpful in the middle of suffering. But here the disciples are with a blind man, and they're asking Jesus for an explanation. Hey, Jesus, can you give us the explanation for this? Can you explain this way for us? We'd like to fit it in a nice category, and then we can move on. We see suffering, we see a problem. If you can give us an explanation that makes sense of it, then we can move along with our lives and we can manage things so that kind of thing doesn't happen to us. Jesus resists this idea at every opportunity, and this one is no exception. He says that no one sinned in any way that's related to this blindness. And then he offers a radically different explanation. He says it happened, and I quote, so that the works of God might be displayed in him. He says, whoa. Nobody sinned. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And this is where the idea of signs becomes really important, where it's not just miracles and wonders, but it's a sign of something, a sign that points to something. Now, before we go too much farther in that, there are several ways to interpret what he says, and one of them is kind of problematic. You could make a case that Jesus is saying, whoa. Nobody sinned. He didn't deserve this. See, God knew that 30, 40 years later after this guy was born that I was going to happen to walk by with you guys and I needed an object lesson. So we made him blind for 40 years so that I could have a teaching aid. Yeah, I don't buy that one. I find that God cruel. That doesn't match up with the God most clearly seen in Jesus to me. I don't buy that explanation. Try this one on. Here's an instance of things not being the way they're supposed to be. Here's an instance of suffering that was beyond somebody's control. And when Jesus sees it, what Jesus sees is an opportunity for the glory of God to be shown. An opportunity for those who would follow God to shine God's light, to bring life and hope and healing. I think he's proposing that not just this guy, but every instance of brokenness, every instance of suffering, every instance of things not being the way they're supposed to be is an opportunity for those who would follow God and partner with God to partner with God in bringing things, making things right. Do you follow me? It's a worldview that looks at problems and suffering and darkness not as phenomena that need to be explained away, but as opportunities to point towards God's future, to partner with God in setting things right. You follow me? Hey, what this guy needs isn't an explanation. What this guy needs is hope. What this guy needs is love. What this guy needs is somebody to care. What this guy needs is help. And then because it's John and he only tells us weird stories, he tells you how Jesus does it. There is no way to explain this without it being weird. Jesus then spits on the ground. And in case you were thinking that was a metaphor, John doesn't let you. And he says, and he mixes the dirt with his saliva to make mud. Then he rubs the spit mud on his eyes and says, okay, now I want you to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, a word that means sent, that they feel like they have to tell you. I don't think that the guy had to be encouraged that much to go wash it off. But he goes to the place that Jesus says, I'm assuming he got help. And he washes the spit mud off. And then he can see. Now, I want you to note that it's not even the magic spit mud, apparently, that heals him. It's when he actually steps out in faith and does the thing that Jesus said. It's as he goes, and that's a common theme in these miraculous signs that John tells us about. Actually, all the way through the Bible, it's a common theme. It's that they're healed as they go, that the thing happens as they go. So he steps out in faith and goes and does the thing that frankly doesn't make a lot of sense, except for washing the mud off. Makes a lot of sense. It just doesn't seem like it will have much to do with you being able to see again. And then here's what happens next. John chapter 9, starting in verse 12. Where is the man, they ask him. Remember, they had confronted him and said, hey, are you the same guy? He's like, I'm the guy. This guy they call Jesus, he did some stuff. So they say, where's the man? I don't know, he said. So they brought him to the Pharisees. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now, the day which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. They still did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they had sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one that you say was born blind? How is it that he now can see? We know he's our son, the parents answered. We know he was born blind, but how he can see now and who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That's why his parents said, he is of age. Ask him. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. If as religious people, if as people who go to church and are attempting to follow God, you don't look into the gospel and see the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and the religious leaders as a cautionary tale, you're not reading it right. You always have to look at them through the lens of their, but for the grace of God go I. Because it wasn't a con for them either. They weren't like, hey, if we just use the scriptures, we can really take advantage of it. No, they devoted their lives to this, but they were so committed to their understandings and their way of doing it that when the God they devoted their lives to actually showed up, they didn't just miss him, they opposed him. And you can see how it works here, because you've got a guy, and in the confusion, people go, hey, isn't that blind guy, but he can see now? No, I think it's a look-alike. I think they must find a look-alike. It can't be the same guy. He just looks like the guy. He's like, I'm the guy. So they take him to the religious leaders. And they're like, are you the guy? And he's like, yeah, I'm the guy. And they're like, no, you can't be the guy. And then they send him for his parents, and his parents are like, yeah, he's the guy. And at that point, I need you to understand, at that point, when some of them say, okay, we've really exhausted our options, I think it's the guy, their next move is, hey, but wait a minute. He made the spit mud on the Sabbath day when we're not supposed to do any work. And by our rules, that sure does seem like work, so he can't be from God. Somehow, blind guy born from birth can now see, doesn't carry the weight of it. It's, wait a minute, they really didn't do things in the way that we understood them, so he must be evil? You know, because evil always goes around making blind people see, that kind of thing. That's the threat. It doesn't fit their understanding of things. It doesn't fit their way of doing things. And so they position themselves against it and end up opposing God who's right in front of them. Pick up verse 24. A second time, he summoned the man who had been blind. So he goes away, and they're still worked up about it, so they send for him again and bring him in. A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God and tell the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. That's a fascinating setup. When they say tell the truth, do they really mean tell the truth? See, they've confused the truth with what they already think. They've confused the truth with the status quo. And it's a very easy thing to do. I'm not even really looking down on them for it because it's very easy for us all to slip into. This thing happened. It doesn't fit our categories of understanding, and so we feel threatened by it. So they can't resolve it. They can't get comfortable with it. They call the guy back, and they say, hey, give glory to God by telling the truth. We know this man is a sinner. So the truth that you have to sign off for, that apparently is giving glory to God, they're going to stamp God's name on it, is you have to say that this guy is a sinner. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Again, this guy's had one interaction with Jesus. When he gave them his name, he even said, the guy they call Jesus. He didn't even directly get his name. He just overheard other people calling him Jesus. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. I actually love that. He's like, okay, you're asking me a bunch of questions I don't know anything about. This guy just came up to me. I heard some people call him Jesus. But whatever the answer to your questions are, I used to be blind and I can see now. So what are you going to do with that? Then they ask him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? That's fantastic. That's hilarious. This blind guy's been a comedian in waiting. That is so funny. Do you guys want to be his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes? We know God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. That scene is fantastic. I mean, it's sad, but this guy sees through it. The guy who's been blind for birth and doesn't even have a lot of information, he's the guy who's seeing clearly. He sees what they're doing. Their game doesn't work on him. They're like, glory to God and tell the truth, agree with us in the thing that we already think, so that we can dismiss him and not have to rethink anything. Hey, guys, I don't know. Just saw the guy one time. I didn't really see him that time. I overheard. I heard him spit. There was some mud on my eyes. Seems kind of gross. He told me to go wash. He didn't have to tell me twice. I used to be blind and I can see now. That's the question I can answer. I don't know how it worked. I used to be blind and now I can see. How did he do it? I already told you that. It's going to be the same answer. Why are you asking me again? Do you guys want to be his disciples too? Oh, you jerk, you idiot. And they throw him out of the synagogue. Not because they have proven their case, but because they don't know what to do with it because it doesn't fit in what they already thought. So they put him out of sight so they don't have to deal with it. They try to stigmatize him so everybody else will leave him alone and they won't have to deal with it. And when he calls them on it, that's remarkable. You guys don't even know where he comes from, but he opened my eyes. Are you really saying that this guy doesn't have anything to do with God, but he does God's kind of stuff through God powers? Is that really what you're saying? Their response is, oh, clearly you're evil and steeped with sin. And they threw him out. By the way, when you encounter something that stretches you, that does not fit your pre-existing categories, when you encounter someone who says something, believes something, is living into something that doesn't fit your categories, if your initial response to someone who sees things a different way is, well, either they are stupid, too stupid to understand, they're ignorant, they just don't know, they're evil, they know and they're just trying to mislead people, or they're crazy, so we don't pay attention to it, you're in a bad place. That doesn't necessarily mean that the other person's right. But if that's your immediate reflexive response to shut it down through one of those avenues so you don't have to pay attention to it or consider it, you might want to pump the brakes. Because that's the move of these guys every time. And they're not the good guys in the story. Pick up verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I might believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." And the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. This is fascinating. Jesus, remember the entire setup. They happened to go by the guy. The disciples asked for an explanation to explain his condition away. The disciples see a problem that needs to be explained, but Jesus sees the guy. You follow me? Jesus is the only one who looks at him. And he gives him back his sight. He doesn't give him any kind of explanation. He doesn't say, "All right, go wash your eyes, and when you do, you remember this Bible lesson." He gives him his sight. The guy then has a story that he can't be dissuaded from, that you can't even really argue with, so the people just try to shut him down. Jesus hears the guy that the guy was put out of the synagogue, and so he goes and finds him, and he says, "Hey, do you believe in the Son of Man?" Now, I want you to imagine for a second, you have to totally speculate on this, but you've seen this kind of encounter. If when they had walked up and found the blind guy on the side of the road, their only interaction had been Jesus stopping, looking down at the guy and saying, "Hey, do you believe in the Son of Man? If you died tonight, where would you?" Do you think we would have got the same reaction? See, what I'm going to propose to you here is that Jesus acted as a sign that pointed towards God's future, that pointed towards where things are set right, that pointed towards where things are put back the way they're supposed to be. Jesus brought that future into this guy's life. He brought healing and hope and life into this guy's life. And at that point, Jesus has the right to speak to him. Look at the response. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He doesn't say, "Son of Man, I don't know what you're talking about." He says, "Who is he, sir? Tell me that so that I might believe in him." Hey, I used to be blind, and now I can see. I'm buying what you're selling, man. Been alive for 30 years. Nobody's ever looked at me that way. Nobody's ever cared about me that way. Nobody's ever treated me in that way. Tell me who he is so that I can believe in him. I'm going to suggest that if we actually followed Jesus in that way, if we actually saw instances of suffering and brokenness as to the best of our ability with whatever means are at our disposal, as opportunities to partner with God in bringing life and hope, then when we got around to saying, "Hey, do you believe in Jesus?" we might start getting more responses like, "Hey, tell me about him so I can believe him." Instead of, "I don't want to hear about that. That's personal. Keep that to yourself." Jesus now has the right to, look, I understand he has the right to speak anyway because he's the Son of God. But in the perception of the guy he's talking to, the guy now wants to listen. It's got authority. "I don't even know what you're going to say yet, but tell me so I can believe in it." Because something different happened here. Something different happened with you. I had an opportunity several years ago to go and meet an author. I won't even tell you who it is because I don't want you to say, "You're calling him Jesus." I'm not. But to meet an author that I really liked, and it was a very small retreat. And so I went, and the guy stayed in the bunkhouse with us instead of being in a hotel. I met him in the parking lot. Super nice guy. And it was a guy who had been really important to me. His writing had really helped me. And so I thought going in, I was like, oh, this guy's a jerk. It's really going to devastate me. But he wasn't. He was such a nice and genuine guy. And he's a guy that's taken a whole lot of really harsh criticism, very, very unfair criticism. I don't mean that anybody's beyond criticism, but I do mean the way that people did it was vicious and personal. And so we were in one session, and there was a question and answer thing. People started to ask him about some of the criticisms that had been levied at him. And I've never seen anybody be able to do this genuinely and purely. You could not get him to say anything bad about his critics. He would say stuff like, yeah, I wish he hadn't said that. I don't really think that he understood what I was saying. But did you know that at that guy's church, they do this, and this is how they help people? He actually knew. He had bothered to find out the good that they were doing. He could tell you. And I was like, hey, my first thought was, you are a way better person than I am. But I also thought, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that doesn't just happen to somebody naturally. And some of the stuff that he would say was very challenging to me. It would stretch me, but it made me take a second look at it. Because I was like, he's encountered something. He has done something that has formed him in a way that I'm not able to do by willpower by itself. Now, that is a very low-grade version of what I'm talking about here. But if we had that kind of an encounter with people, if people encounter us and they said there's something going different in the way that you interact with people, in the way that you see the world, you have been formed in a way that doesn't happen naturally and doesn't happen by willpower, those conversations you kind of dread, they might be starting them. They might be asking for them. You might not need to have a methodology to make a sales pitch. You might just be explaining the thing that made the difference in your life because they want to know. Let's finish up here. John chapter 9, starting verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into the world, so that the blind will see, and that those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard them say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" And Jesus said, catch this. Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." Okay. He goes into the really enigmatic Jesus thing at first. He goes, "For judgment I've come into the world, so that the blind will see, and those who can see will become blind." Now, one of the most comical things, if you learn to look for it in the Gospels, is how many times Jesus uses metaphors and how many times nobody gets it. You got to be born again. How can I be born? How do I wind up in my mother's womb again? No. That's not what I mean. It's a metaphor. All the way through the Bible. He's not just talking about, hey, you know why I came? Because I was going to run into blind guys. I was going to make them see. He's talking about something bigger than that, isn't he? Some Pharisees who do get the metaphor. That's what's fascinating. The Pharisees get the metaphor. They're like, hey, wait a minute. Are you saying that we're blind? And Jesus says, hey, I tell you the truth. If you were blind, we wouldn't have a problem. We wouldn't be guilty of sin. But since you're the one going around telling everybody you can see, that's where we got a problem. That's why you're so steeped in guilt here. If you have the gall, and I say this as someone who has frequently had the gall, if you have the gall to say that you have comprehended completely an infinite God with your 3-pound brain, well, you can see the problem there, right? If you're not looking at the Pharisees and the teachers' law as a cautionary tale that we got to pay attention to, because we who love God and devote ourselves to God can miss God if we get focused on the wrong things. We can make an idol of even our ideas about God. And that's where we get in trouble. You who claim you can see, you're the ones who are in trouble, because that's the same reason that Jesus says all the time, hey, if you got ears to hear, use them. If you got eyes to see, use them. Because if you're claiming, hey, I've already got this down, I've already got this figured out, you're saying something different, that can't possibly be it, so I'm going to rule it out. Again, that doesn't mean anybody who says something that you don't already think is right. But it also means the thing that you know, if we're having a rational conversation, I can't possibly have it all figured out yet. For the rest of our lives, we who have devoted our lives to being remade into the image of Jesus are going to be growing, changing, and learning. Right up until our last breath. And when we position ourselves as if that's not the case, that's where we get in trouble. Matter of fact, that's where we lose the ability to learn and grow. Because we run everything through a filter that either reaffirms what we already think or we rule out as stupid, ignorant, crazy, or evil. So we don't have to deal with it. You know, you're steeped in sin and birth, and we put them out of sight so we don't have to deal with it. And if you want a strategy for missing God, that's it. Is it that much of a stretch for us to come to God, for us to come together and admit that we're blind, that we don't see it all, that we don't have it figured out, that we need wisdom and life and hope and refreshing from God, from God's Holy Spirit that he promised? That we need God's word to inform what's going on because we don't have it figured out. Because left to our own devices, we fly the plane into the ground. That we need to be surrounded by these other broken but redeemed people who God sometimes speaks wisdom to us through. Because we're blind. And as long as we don't admit that we're blind, we get to, anybody that wants to can just lead us around wherever they want to. And because we're trying to so confabulate that we're not blind, we just go along with it like we see clearly. But when we admit that we're limited, that we're blind, when we own our own limitations, then Jesus can say, okay, I can work with that. You got ears to hear. You've got eyes to see. Let me show you what you were meant to be. Let me show you what I can do with you. Are we willing to become blind so that we can see? So may we learn to see instances of darkness and suffering as an opportunity to partner with God in shining his light and showing his love. May we be willing to admit our own blindness and limitations so that we may be able to truly see. And may the God of hope fill us with all joy and peace as we trust in him, that we may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And the church said together,